to talk a little about the Presidio, but also you made a great point the other night. The American Revolution was on, and it was a matter of survival. With all that was going on back east, here it was all about survival. So I'd like to ask you to readdress that, and also anything you want to add on the Anza Trail, your experience.
Sure. Well, everything's been said already, so I got to make some stuff up. One of the most significant things that I think a lot of people miss when you talk about this area in the 1770s, when they moved the Presidio from Tubac up to Tucson, is Spain has been they're 250 years into the conquest of Mexico. So the people that get here are not the same people that landed in 1519. It's not Cortez and his crew. This is mestizos now, mostly, that are up here. So you have a demographic shift, a cultural shift that has already taken place. And life out here, specifically for Tubaqueños or Tucsonenses, the people here are engaged in a war, a fight that's existential. They're with the Apache. And that is the primary focus here. That is the case for 250 years. Apaches dominate life out here for everyone, for the O'odham, for the Spanish, for the Mexican, and later for the Americans. And they're largely forgotten about when you talk about the history of this place. They're left out of most museums, and when they are included, it's a very, they're two-dimensional little players and set pieces in the story. But they play a huge role, and that is primarily what Tubaqueños and Tucsonenses are concerned about. While global affairs and the American Revolution and things that are going on in Spain, the 7 Years' War, the Bourbon reforms, all of those things, they have impacts out here. But for the people that actually lived here, they're engaged in a fight for survival out here, living in these small little communities. The colonizers, most definitely, that came in. Important to remember their stories, though. I think all of this is incredibly significant. We talked about it the other day, but the more you understand about history, the more you understand that you don't know anything. And like I often say, what I understand about it today is very different than what it was a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. My perception of the history of here, of the American Revolution, I can't wait to see the other 11 hours and 15 minutes of this thing, because, yeah, we're Spain in that whole thing. But we only watched a little tiny piece of it. But I hope that my perception of history is different in 1 year, in 3 years, and 5 years from now, because I should hopefully be open to new perspectives. And that is, without that, if I still see things the same way, then I've obviously begun to believe my own BS. And I'm not accepting any new information, because there's just so many different perspectives. The Anza Trail is representative of that in how we tell that story today as opposed to how we told it 20 years ago. The history books about the history of this area, the American Revolution. One of the most significant things is just my history here. I'm a descendiente of families that were here in the Presidio in Tucson. I have relatives that were in Tubac, no direct descendants that I can find so far, but we definitely were in Tucson in 1780. With all that in mind, my history goes, the old trope is true in this case. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Which takes absolutely nothing away to the contributions that my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather made to the United States and to America and to what this country is. But I think a lot of that is lost sometimes when you have a very simplistic view of what this country is and old narratives that have been fought so hard to change what this country really is about, and the diversity and the amount of people that went into building it. And it's not always pretty, so please don't think I'm putting, my ancestors up onto, they did horrible things, but that is history. And understanding that, and not trying to, but being open to as many different perspectives is the closest approximation to truth that we're ever going to get in history, because history is always an interpretation, no matter what. But you have to remain open to new perspectives. And and not try and erase the histories. But that's all I have to. What was the other question? I had to make something up, right?
Could I jump in here?
Yes, Professor, please.
I have the honor of speaking at the Presidio.
Microphone, please.
I had the honor of speaking at the Presidio this summer. I think it was 98 degrees at 7 o'clock. And what we have to remember is Tucson has always been a multi-ethnic community. As Mauro said, these people weren't Castilian Spaniards. They weren't conquistadores. By the time they got to Tucson, you had nearly 3 centuries of racial intermixture between Spaniards and indigenous people, between Spaniards and Africans. How many of you have ever seen the Costa paintings, examples of that? They're paintings done during the colonial period that illustrate every possible intermixture that occurred in New Spain during the colonial period, whether you were 1/8 Spaniard and 3/8 this and 4/8 that. But by the time they got up here to the frontier, a lot of those distinctions that might have been important in Mexico City had been lost because of the survival that Mauro was talking about. And even though it hadn't happened yet, in 20 years, by the 1790s, there would be a community of Apaches living in Tucson, as well as Hispanos and Atom. And the survival of this little community depended on all of those people working together. Because one thing that the Spaniards did later in the colonial period was they finally got their act together so they could mount offensives into Apache territory, but they also developed this policy of basically bribing the Apaches into peace if they would settle near Presidios. And one of the largest Apache communities was right here in Tucson. And in a census in the 1830s, there were more Apaches living here than there were Tucsonenses, Hispanos.
Defending the settlements against other Apaches. The Apache is responsible for the survival of the settlement in Tucson as anyone. But that's not normally told here.
And one last thing I want to leave is that, the British did everything they could to slander the Spaniards during the colonial period because, they were bitter enemies and they had been since the 1500s. So the so-called Leyenda Negra, or the black legend that Spain was, exceptionally cruel among all the European nations. Well, where do most Native Americans in the United States live today? Pardon? Well, yeah, but I mean geographically.
Oh dear.
After Oklahoma, which was sort of the catch-all, because the British formed alliances with Native Americans like the Iroquois. But once they had defeated their European enemies, they pushed Native Americans further and further and further west. And a lot of them ended up in Oklahoma. The Spaniards, on the other hand, really tried to incorporate Native Americans into their society. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't cruelty, there wasn't exploitation, there was. But in Spanish society, the color lines were much less hardened than they were in British America and later in the United States of America, where miscegenation was a crime for, in most states, really until the 20th century. And those color lines were a lot less hardened in Spanish America. So there were more unions between indigenous people and Spaniards, and also Africans and Spaniards. So,
Well, the government encouraged the intermingling with the native populations.
right. But that's why, we have. Thank you. That's why we have, probably 600,000 Native Americans living in Arizona and the Southwest now, because Spain tried to incorporate them into their society.